Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 158. This week the questions are taken from guide 214, that's the guide to the second Königsberg class of cruisers of the Imperial German Navy, and the second part of our U-Boats of World War I special. So let's begin with questions. Stavka asks, can you recommend some in-depth sources about the Italian Mars boats? And similarly, Santiago Trujillo Tobon asks, do you have a good source for German cruisers of the World War I era? An excellent starting point, well, for Imperial German and to an extent Kriegsmarine ships generally, but particularly World War I German cruisers, would be this book, German Warships 1815 to 1945, Volume 1, Major Surface Vessels, by Erich Gröner. I think that's how it's pronounced. There is, as you might know with this, a revised and expanded version out, which obviously I recommend you get. Beyond that, there are a couple of other books once you've gone through the information in that book, but if you want to sort of jump from the overview that Gröner gives into sort of a more comprehensive breakdown of specific ships, then for most of the World War I era German cruisers, there are articles in either Warship or Warship International, both of which are periodicals, which will cover various specific German cruiser classes. And those, I think, are probably some of the better places to find information about specific classes if you've identified one you want to know a bit more about based on this book. For Mars boats, or MAS boats, the Italian motor torpedo boats, that's a bit harder because from everything I can see, the single best reference source for them is probably going to be a book by Erminio Bagnasco, I think. I keep horribly mispronouncing his name. Basically, the Italian historian who recently did an English language book on the Littorio class and has one on the Conte di Cavour and Andrea Doria class coming out soon, which is definitely on my pre-order list. But unfortunately, this particular one, at least as far as I'm aware, he's only published in Italian, which is really irritating for everyone who doesn't speak Italian. But it's called MAS, and again, I apologise to my Italian listeners, Mezzi d'Assalto di Superficie Italiani, possibly. I think that's how it's pronounced anyway. So yeah, if you happen to read Italian or know someone who reads Italian, that's a good one to go for. Otherwise, if you can get your hands on, again, Warship 2008 or Warship 2009, those two journals, there's a two-part article in there, authored by three separate authors, including Bagnasco, and that also covers the Mars boats. So I'd highly recommend that if you can get your hands on a copy of Warship, and if you can't, drop me a line because I do have copies of both of those editions. Captain Weebson asks, if you swapped Lusitania with Titanic, would she survive, considering that Lusitania had coal bunkers parallel to the side of the ship, which would effectively make it double-skinned on paper? She should have a higher chance of survival. Conversely, would Titanic survive the torpedo hit which sank Lusitania? The engineer in me says the answer to both questions is probably actually yes, but with some heavy caveats. Because, yes, Lusitania has coal bunkers all the way down the outside of her engine and room's machinery spaces, and they do actually have longitudinal bulkheads which divide off the coal bunkers from the rest of the ship. Titanic only has the transverse bulkheads that run across the ship, and Lusitania has those as well. So, in theory, the iceberg ripping open the side of Lusitania the same way it did to Titanic should just flood the coal bunkers, which would necessitate, you'd think, that the ship would survive because there's a lot more of the ship that isn't being flooded. However, my only concern is that depending on exactly where the gash is opened up, those coal bunkers are actually quite long without any transverse bulkhead interruptions. And so an unlucky strike that opened up all of one and parts of, say, two others might still provide enough flooding that the ship goes down. Then again, if it opens up two, it might not. The main thing is that the Lusitania class is slightly less stable than the Olympic class, of which obviously Titanic is a member, and the one problem with the situation is that now all the flooding's on one side, so the Lusitania is probably going to list quite heavily, and that it may then take it to a point where it would capsize anyway, regardless of whether or not it's actually got enough water in it to sink it, at least until it capsizes. But maybe 7-8 times out of 10, if the iceberg only opens up a couple of those long coal bunkers, then yeah, it probably could survive. It could use a counter flooding system like you'd find in warships to try and stay stable, but I don't think the Lusitania actually has that. They might be able to pull off something manually, I guess, but it would be very precarious, in whatever case. Now, as far as Titanic surviving the torpedo hit that sank Lusitania, that much, yeah, it probably could, just mainly on the grounds, again, of where does this torpedo hit, how much damage does it do in terms of how long a breach along the hull does it make. Famously, Titanic was breached just enough that a number of compartments breached was enough to start dragging it down, and also the compartments weren't topped, so once the ship went quite heavily bow down, it then started to overflow into the next compartment, and that was pretty much all she wrote. So it's possible Titanic is somewhat larger, it displaces somewhat more than Lusitania, so the same amount of flooding would pose slightly less of a sinking risk, and the flooding, if it does occur, is going, because of the lack of the longitudinal bulkheads, is going to mean the ship just goes down gradually on a roughly even keel, which is consistent with what happened when Titanic actually sank. So even if Titanic sinks, it's going to be in a position to get off more lifeboats, and therefore there'll be more people surviving. But I have a feeling that, again, as long as the hit doesn't open up too many compartments, which it might not do, then Titanic might just about survive, just through sheer additional size, meaning there's more of the rest of the ship holding it up compared to Lusitania for a given amount of flooding. Now, the one thing you also have to caveat on this is that if the two ships were switched, neither situation is likely to arise in the first place, because the two ships are of different speeds. Lusitania is actually slightly faster than Titanic, so if Lusitania is operating at the same percentage of power output as Titanic was in 1912, chances are Lusitania just breezes on past through that section of sea before the iceberg arrives in its path. So it probably wouldn't hit the iceberg in the first place, and similarly, because Titanic is slightly slower, it won't be in that exact spot where the U-boat can spot it and torpedo it. It will be, at that point, given it's coming to the end of its voyage, quite some miles further back, so it's likely again that the two just miss each other completely. Carl Dubé asks, what does it mean for a ship to be used as a hulk? I kind of thought it was what you did with a ship before you sunk it to make it an artificial reef, but it seems not to be that. So in naval terms, a hulk is a ship that remains able to float, but has had any ability to self-motivate. And that's not just in terms of keeping spirits up, that's in terms of like being able to move around, whether under sail or under engine power. That's been removed. So it's effectively just a floating object now. It's no longer a mobile ship. And those hulks can be used for all sorts of things. Sometimes ammunition stored on them, largely on the basis that, well, you can come alongside them much more easily in a ship to re-ammunition yourself, but also if it catches fire and explodes, it's not on shore, so hopefully the damage is somewhat reduced. They can be used for prisons, they can be used for general purpose storage, and they're quite often used as accommodation vessels. So once you've removed the ship's ability to move around, so a lot of its machinery in the case of newer vessels, and sails and masts in the case of older vessels, and usually the armament as well, you suddenly find you have a lot more volume in the ship than you would if the ship was still in service, and therefore they make quite efficient storage vessels, whether that be for humans or for general cargo. Quite often with hulks, you'll also see, as you can see in this picture, people will put up either awnings or even small structures on top of the ship to further expand the usable space aboard. And so hulks can also then end up being used as training ships, in terms of not training someone how to run and operate a ship, but in terms of basically being a kind of floating building that you can use as a academy, school, classroom, etc., etc. Harley O'Keefe asks, I recently rewatched your video on HMS Victory, and it got me wondering, if there are 800 men manning a ship, then how on earth do boarding actions take place? How much of the ship would have to be taken for victory to be declared, and were there any specific targets? When it comes to boarding any kind of ship, but especially a ship of the line that might have, as you say, anything up to 800 men on it, the number of men can be somewhat deceptive, because an awful lot of those men are going to be on the gun decks of the ship, not so much on the upper deck. And this is quite important, because if you can have control of the upper deck and quarterdeck of a ship, especially in the age of sail, anyone who's on a lower deck is at your mercy, because there's only a limited number of ways for them to come up, which involve either ladders or steep stairs, which means that if you're waiting at the top, you can basically kill them as they come up. There's larger hatchways and such as well, but you've got similar issues trying to come up through those, and quite often they're somewhat covered anyway. And unlike an ironclad or later steam vessel, what you've got up top is the means of propulsion, the sails. You can cut the mast, well, you can't cut down the mast, but you can cut the rigging in order to disable the ship's ability to sail. You have control of the ship's wheel. Now, granted, theoretically, someone could be operating the tiller further down, but people don't tend to think that far ahead. Also, the ship's flags are there, and you can haul down their colours, which is obviously the internationally recognised method of surrender. And at that point, once you've got control of the upper and quarterdeck, it means you've probably also taken out most of the ship's senior leadership, because the captain, the first officer, the master of the ship, etc., are all likely to be up there as well. So you'll have either captured or killed them. And whilst the men down below in the gun decks might want to make a fight of it, the simple fact is that not only do you have a decisive advantage if you have control of the deck above them, as I said earlier, of being able to just knock them off as they come up, but also for the majority of this period, grenades are a thing. And you can just, if you really, really want to, and the crew are being extremely resistant, you can just start throwing grenades down. And that's not going to end well for anyone below decks. And if it sets fire to the ship, that's even worse. But hey, you're on the upper deck, quarterdeck. If the ship gets set on fire, you can just batten the hatches down, leave everyone to their fate, and leave. The people inside the ship can't. Plus, of course, the somewhat in-between section, you can also fire down into there with muskets, which puts the gun crews at a double disadvantage, because they're also potentially being shot at by your own guns. So, effectively, by taking the upper and quarter deck, you have taken control of the ship, and that means you only, quote-unquote, have to get rid of the men who are on that upper deck, which is going to be a far smaller number of men, and that's why you have things like carronades loaded with grape shot, and in earlier times swivel guns, snipers up in the mast, as Nelson found out, etc., to try and whittle down the numbers of people you'll be facing in the first place. So if you've got a first-rate ship of the line, yeah, you might have 50 to 100 people on the upper deck, but that's a far cry from, the other 700 to 750 people on the gun decks below, and even further down in the ship in the orlop deck and such like. And so you've only got to kill, wound, or persuade to surrender roughly those 50 to 100 people before you have overall control of the ship. Effectively, you have everyone else at your mercy, and the system of sort of honourable surrender that existed at the time meant that, for the most part, people who were on the gun decks, if they suddenly discovered everybody above them had either been killed or had surrendered, would just go along with it, because the alternative was probably a futile death, and no one was that enamoured with the idea. Now, of course, people knew this, so when a boarding action was very clearly imminent, there were many cases where the gun crews would be called to the upper deck to either board an enemy or to repel boarders, to increase the number of people who could oppose or partake in a boarding action, which in turn obviously would maximise the chances of the ship either successfully taking its target or successfully defending itself against being taken. But that is a very critical call to make, because of course every gun crew who's up on the deck fighting hand to hand or with muskets is a gun crew who is not firing the guns of the ship to, either defend or attack. So you do have to make that judgment call very, very carefully, otherwise you risk losing both ways, because you could, say, call up the first gun deck down's crew to help, so now you have loads of men on your upper and quarter deck, fantastic, you can repel any number of boarders, except even on a first rate, you've now cut the number of guns that you can fire by a third, roughly, and if your enemy has, a bunch of carronades loaded with grape shot, you may have just given them a target-rich environment. Jake Galvin asks, did Royal Navy submarines have much impact in the Pacific, or was most of the work done by the Americans and, to an extent, the Dutch? Royal Navy submarines did make a fair impact in the Pacific War, but it was a matter of an escalating impact, whereas earlier in the Pacific War, at least once the torpedo problems had been sorted out, it was mainly the heavy lifting being done by the Americans and, as you say, the Dutch, the Australians, basically almost everyone else. And just as a little bit of a random side note, but recently when I've been reading up on the Eastern Fleet and their various orders, instructions, meeting minutes, etc., I've been reading through a lot of archival material at the Kew National Archives. Although I've said before that Admiral Helfrich was highly rated by the Allies, I think I need to emphasise again just how highly rated he was, because going through these orders, and bear in mind these are orders, memos, telegrams, encrypted communications, discussions, etc., for the entirety of the Eastern Fleet Command, pretty much for what I was reading, from early 1940 through to late 1943, there was a huge amount, surprisingly, of correspondence either about, to, or for Admiral Helfrich, and almost all of it was positives. Admiral Helfrich wants to do this. Can we help him do this? Admiral Helfrich has achieved this. This is great, fantastic. Now we can do something else. Admiral Helfrich would like access to these documents. Can we please give him access? And then when people occasionally came back and said, no, he's not a British officer, we can't do that for secrecy reasons, you had officers for the Royal Navy saying, stop being stupid, he's one of the best people that we as an alliance of nations have against Japan, give him what he needs. So yeah, anyway, that aside, the Royal Navy's main problem when it came to submarines and operating them in the Pacific was that at the start of World War II, they actually had a very nice set of submarines all set ready to go in various naval bases to prosecute a war against Japan, most of which were T-class long-range fleet submarines. And then, of course, in 1939, Japan didn't declare war. Germany did. And so some of the submarines over in the Far East were drawn back to the Atlantic and, questionably for the T-class, the Mediterranean and the North Sea, etc., to help pursue a war against Germany. Then the Italians got involved, and even more submarines from the Far Eastern fleet had to be drawn away to help with that. Again, the T-class didn't exactly cover themselves in too much glory in the Mediterranean. They weren't really suited for it. That's what you really want a U-class for. But anyway, a number of T-class by that point, they kind of realised that. They took them into the Atlantic, etc. And British submarines had a surprisingly good run taking out German U-boats with a 4-to-1 kill-death ratio, if you're measuring things via that way. And they killed a lot more subs than that. That's just the ratio of kills to losses. But anyway, what all of this meant was that when Japan declared war, all the lovely pre-positioned Pacific-trained and ready to go British fleet submarines were now almost exclusively not in the Pacific, or the Indian Ocean for that matter. So the initial British contribution to the submarine campaign was relatively small at times, down to just 4 submarines. But as 1942 war got into 1943, the Italians bowed out of the war, which released a lot of submarines from the Mediterranean, so some of those could go and relieve submarines operating in the Atlantic and the North Sea, etc., so that they could go to the Pacific. Other submarines that were in the Mediterranean went straight to the Indian Ocean and Pacific, so the number of British submarines went up. And as the war progressed and more submarines started to enter the water, and the number of Kriegsmarine and other German surface targets, etc., decreased, a number of other submarines that had been operating against the Kriegsmarine were reallocated as well. So the number of British submarines, and therefore their effectiveness in the Pacific, would go up from 1943 onwards, and they'd score more and more impressive kills as time went on. One of them being the Japanese heavy cruiser Ashigara, sunk by HMS Trenchant, which is why Ashigara has been gracing your screens while I've been answering this particular question. One of the more notable things was that because a lot of the US submarines were their big fleet submarines, they tended to operate in deeper waters, longer range missions, and therefore had a certain sort of flavour of Japanese shipping to go after, whilst the T-class were also suited to this kind of operational mission, with a few variants depending on their exact specification for range, etc., as opposed to the American fleet subs. Because the British, thanks in large part to the Mediterranean War, did also have this quite large fleet of medium and smaller subs, as well as some operational capabilities of the T-class themselves, they were assigned quite often, as their numbers increased, to coastal and shallow water operations, which the Americans felt that their larger subs were perhaps less suited for than others. Now, that didn't stop American subs operating off of the coast of Japanese-held installations and islands, obviously shooting up trains and putting rocket launchers on the back of their subs and everything. It did happen, but more and more as the war progressed, you'd find the Royal Navy being assigned to those kinds of missions, and the American fleet subs tending more and more to looking for targets in the deeper ocean. Although, again, the Royal Navy would also go looking for targets in the deeper ocean, especially with the T-class where they could. The Royal Navy also used a bunch of the X-craft, these little midget submarines, in various operations against Japanese shipping, with varying degrees of success depending on the mission. Galdir Ioni asks, some navies in the World Wars gave their submarines names, others only used numbers, and some use a mix of both. How did various navies decide on which vessels were considered ships with their own names and which were just numbered boats? Again, it's one of these questions to which the basic answer is it varies dramatically, but the general theme seems to be that if a navy considered something to be a boat, it tended to get a alphanumerical designation, whereas if they considered it a ship, it got a name. So a lot of the time when you look at, say, the Germans, they considered the submarines to be boats, so it's U insert number, but they also considered what everyone else by the sort of World War I period was considering to be destroyers. They were still calling them torpedo boats, and so they got numbered instead of names. And that particular element of German culture pretty much held through most of their run up to the end of World War II. There were occasional points where torpedo boats or destroyers would receive names, but they equally drop back to using numbers again thereafter in some cases. With the British, they started off with giving their submarines numbers only. That's why when you read World War I submarine accounts by Royal Navy officers or about Royal Navy operations, you'll see things like HMS E5 or HMS B3 or HMS C2. Hit, you sunk by battleship. But towards the end of the war, they started a program whereby new build submarines would begin to be named, and that's continued on, even though they also have a hull number, but they will continue to be named thereafter. And a lot of that comes down to, at least in the Royal Navy, the change in perception of submarines from almost an expendable small-scale combatant to a serious weapon of war, and something that's designed to last. And so if it's something that's a serious weapon of war and designed to last, it should have a name, and so names become to be established. That's why, for example, when you get the X-craft being built, they're just called X1, X2, X3, X4, etc., because whilst they're relatively serious weapons of war designed to do a fair bit of damage, they're not really... It's nice if you get them back, but it's not really considered likely in a lot of cases. And so as semi-expendable craft as compared to their mother submarines, they only get the alphanumerical designations again. The US is almost like an inverse version of the Germans. The Germans almost go with almost entirely alphanumerical designations with a sort of a bit in the middle where they give some names. The US, on the other hand, they started off with their submarines being given names, and then they decided to redesignate them all, and a bunch that had names were now redesignated to just alphanumerical designators. And then after a while, they, again, round about the same time as the British in the interwar period, they decided that was a silly idea and went back to giving their submarines names again. The other thing, whilst this is not 100% reliable, but as I would say a trend rather than a pattern, but the larger navies who have the ability and end up in fact doing so, producing lots of submarines, tend to be the ones that are affected more by giving them an alphanumeric designator, whereas navies that are producing somewhat fewer submarines, at least at first, sometimes they build up larger fleets later, they're the ones who tend to give them names right off the bat, because there's not that many of them, which generally implies there's not that many ships in the Navy, so you have a surplus of names, so you might as well use as many names as you can. Whereas, as I say, in the larger navies, if you've got vast amounts of things going around, then the temptation to use an alphanumeric designator is much, much higher. And of course, if you started off as a smallish navy naming your subs, and then you start building lots of them, that trend kind of just sticks, unless, as I say, unless you're the US Navy, who decides periodically to redesignate everything. Charles Roman asks, are there any good sources for information on the American D-class submarines? Well, since it seems to be book recommendation week, here's another book to recommend. Norman Friedman's US Submarines Through 1945, An Illustrated Design History. Excellent book, if you can get your hands on a copy of it. Just remember to look for this kind of turquoisey green cover, because that's US Submarines Through to 1945. If you get the one with the blue cover, well, it'll still be very interesting, but it won't tell you anything about the D-class, because that one will be the one that goes from 1945 onwards. Athol Anderson asks, if Spain had joined World War II, joining the Axis, what sort of navy did they have, and how much of an impact would it have made on the Atlantic or Mediterranean operations? Unfortunately, the single biggest impact the Spanish Armada could have had in World War II would probably have been in the form of giving the Axis access to its various bases, especially on the Atlantic coast, which probably would have come in handy for the odd German U-boat or two, and possibly for Italian or German ships trying to stage some attack down onto Gibraltar. But in terms of the actual strength of the Spanish Navy, well, let's just say they've just finished a civil war in which all their remaining battleships, and one of their heavy cruisers got sunk, as well as a bunch of smaller ships. Their sum total force at this point amounts to 1 heavy cruiser. Okay, it's a decent modern heavy cruiser, but it's still only 1. 5 light cruisers, none of which are treaty limit max cruisers. They're all much older, smaller vessels. 3 of them are very old. 2 of them are somewhat newer, but still small. And then you've got less than a couple of dozen destroyers. Again, granted, the majority of those are newish, modernish, and a few really old ones, and about the same number of subs. The subs are probably the biggest single problem, mostly because they're hard to track down, but for the rest, it means that at any given point, the deployable strength of the Spanish Navy is going to be 2, maybe 3 cruisers, 8 to 10 destroyers, and maybe about the same number of subs on a good day, which means that, yeah, their overall impact in terms of surface ships, and bearing in mind, obviously, these ships are going to be scattered through a number of Spanish ports, is not going to be all that much of anything. If anything else, it's just going to give the Royal Navy a chance to, pretend to be Francis Drake for a day, because that's really probably all it's going to take to get rid of any Spanish ships that sail out. Even with the Royal Navy being pulled pillar to post in the Mediterranean, a single British heavy cruiser squadron with some escorts, or perhaps one of the better light cruiser squadrons that's equipped with mostly town class, along with escorts, could probably deal with the Spanish Navy very quickly if the Spanish Navy was foolish enough to come out and confront them in the open ocean. Even Force H on its own, they've usually got a carrier and a capital ship of some sort, and usually more. It's just a too small navy to make an impact, as I say, outside of the submarines, because submarines generally are quite difficult to deal with. T-Bone asks, what is the biggest exterior determinator of a given nation's naval policy, i.e., how much was the Royal Navy shaped by the need to police the Empire, and how much by the rise of Germany? The single biggest determinator of a given nation's naval policy comes down to, is our nation existentially threatened if we do not have a navy, or if we do not have a navy of a given strength? That's basically the first and overriding priority. If a country can be threatened with effectively annihilation or being forced into surrendering purely by exercise of sea power, then that nation has to have a navy. You see this most obviously with the Royal Navy, but also with the Japanese Navy. Part of the reason that the Japanese built up their fleet so quickly and so massively was because they were quite happy being an island nation without a particularly great navy, and then Commodore Perry showed up and said, hey, you're going to open yourselves up to trade, and if you don't, well, I have a bunch of big ships and you can't do anything to me. And, well, the Japanese realised, well, yeah, we're going to have to open up, but we're also going to very quickly industrialise and buy a lot of ships and build our navy up very quickly, because this has highlighted a rather important flaw in our overall security plans. The sort of, I guess, corollary to that is that nations who aren't necessarily that easy to threaten in an existential manner from the sea also tend to have fairly large land borders, and so the army is competing even more with the navy for funding, more so than it just would be strictly if it was who's threatened the most, or what service wants the funding. Second to that is, what is the nation's interest politically? So you can see something like, say, the USA. It doesn't meet that first criteria. It's not existentially threatened by sea power. It's too big for that. It can be economically threatened by sea power, which is pretty much what was happening to it in 1814, but its existence as a nation in terms of people starving and rioting in the streets can't be affected that way by naval power. It can only have its economy destroyed, quote unquote, only. But anyway, so the US was isolationist for the majority of the 19th century, and as a result, it didn't see any need to fund a navy. It had the ability to fund a navy. It had the industry to build a navy larger than it had at the time, but there was no political motivation, and so they didn't. And then in the 20th century there was, and then they built a large navy. The Germans similarly, for the early part of the existence of the German state, it was a coastal defence force. They had lots of people who'd like to take a chunk out of them with land borders, so going back to where's the existential threat from point one. And so the German army was the main focus, but then the Kaiser decided he wanted to, stand up to / confront the Royal Navy, and suddenly Germany had a big fleet. Then third, you've got what overseas assets does your nation need to maintain? So this is where you've got overseas colonial possessions usually, and you want to keep them going, or overseas bases, etc., or perhaps you just want to keep an eye on what your enemies are doing, and they're a long way away. An example of this kind of thing would be maybe the Dutch Navy. So the Dutch Navy, obviously, they had their heyday in the early age of sail, but by the 19th and 20th centuries, economically, the Netherlands had been eclipsed by quite a number of powers, and they had Germany on one side, France on the other, Belgium kind of there being itself, the place where European nations go to settle their differences, but they really didn't have much cause, if you look at point one and point two, for a navy. I mean, you could threaten the Dutch from the sea, but they had much more pressing land border concerns. That's where the existential threat was. And they didn't have a particularly aggressive, we want to challenge the Royal Navy again policy. But what they did have was a bunch of colonial possessions, which they needed to manage, regulate, and safeguard. And so they had to have a navy of some description, mostly configured towards colonial work. And then you have, fourthly, what is your opponent doing, or opponents? So the Royal Navy in the latter part of the 19th century, it had a powerful force of capital ships, but they were scattered across the world, showing that the Royal Navy was big and impressive and scary all over the place. And then beyond that, you had the various cruiser forces, corvettes, sloops, etc., doing colonial policing, etc., trade safeguarding, and so forth. But then Germany started building a big navy, and now all of a sudden, instead of having squadron of battleships here, squadron of battleships there, fleet of battleships in the Mediterranean, fleet at home, etc., all of a sudden it became, okay, almost all the battleships that are worth having need to be at home to guard against this big fleet that Germany is building. And everything else now falls to cruisers and gunboats and sloops and etc. And now we need a much more homogeneous force. So instead of building, a couple of ships to respond to that class and a couple of ships to respond to that class, we're now building 4 or more battleships of the same class in a year, and then we're moving on to the next class the next year with improved technology and so on and so forth. And so it's a combination of those 4 factors. The first and overriding one is, where does the existential or potential existential threat to your nation come from? The land or the sea? That is going to be the single biggest factor. And then the other 3 that we mentioned are going to combine to create a direction and shape of your naval policy, which might change depending on the circumstances as the decades roll on. There is obviously the ancillary to it of how big a navy can you actually build, but that's an interior issue rather than an exterior issue. Where it becomes an exterior issue is the comparative of how big a navy can you build compared to your opponents, because your potential opponents might have a massive navy and you might be existentially threatened by naval forces if you're a small island nation or a nation that depends mostly on trade and is largely coastal. But if you have no particular shipbuilding industry and a not particularly great GDP, there's not an awful lot you can actually do about it. And you can see this all through history, but for example, Sicily, when it was an independent kingdom of the 2 Sicilies, it's a small island nation, mostly. They had some holdings on mainland Italy as well, but it could be existentially threatened from the sea. So its enemies had large fleets. It really, really needed to be able to defend itself. It ticked all the boxes, and it had a few little overseas possessions to protect as well. But it was a small nation. They physically couldn't build a fleet large enough to challenge the French or the Spanish or the British, etc. And so they did the best they could, but you had to draw a line somewhere and say, look, we can only have ships up to a certain size, kind of a deterrent force, almost. They're seagoing, so it's not a perfectly equivalent comparison, but almost like the coastal defence battleships that a lot of Scandinavian countries built. It was a force designed to deter rather than a force that's designed to attack. And you can see this across the world even today. There are plenty of nations where you can point out that, yeah, actually a seaborne blockade could completely ruin this nation, but their navy isn't particularly large because they've looked at the calculations and gone, well, the only people who would actually show up and try and do this to us are so massively more powerful than us that even if we sunk like late World War I, early 1920s level of Japanese level of investment into our navy, like 30% of our GDP, we're still not going to come anywhere close to matching our potential enemies in firepower, so there's no point in wasting the money. Adam Schindler asks, how did watch standing evolve over time from the age of sail to the modern era? Did the amount of space available for berthing or messing, or the different requirements for the ship's crew, change how crew schedules and accommodations functioned? The actual amount of time and the division of labour within ships, as in you have 2 watches or 3 watches, etc., doesn't really change all that much as a result of changes to technology, because ultimately you're still running a ship. But in terms of the specific watches, then yes, there were some additional ones added. For example, in the Age of Sail, there was no need for an engineering watch post because, well, there weren't any engines. And similarly, although there was a need for a form of communications watch, this would usually just be part of the duties of whoever was on lookout duty in the crow's nest, because, communication such as it was by light or by flag was all part of that element. Whereas obviously once you get into the 20th century and you have radio, you need to have a specific communications watch officer who's keeping an eye on radio transmissions, as well as, the lookouts who might spot flag or lamp communication. And likewise, berthing and accommodation didn't change all that much. There were people and crews still using hammocks well into the 20th century. Then they switch over to bunks, which is somewhat better, but doesn't manifestly affect the number and type of watches that need to be stood, because, as I say, that's all affected just by the fact you're running a ship and you've got certain posts that are dictated by that ship, and those don't change. So, a radio communications watch officer would be needed in, say, a World War I ship, and they'd be needed in a World War II ship, and those two ships might be very different, but fundamentally it's still radio. Obviously, as there are more and more things that are added to ships, you might need different watch officers assigned to multiple different sections of the ship. So you might have radar, sonar, all of these kinds of things, and they might end up with their own dedicated watch officers if needed. The only place where watches tended to change quite radically as a result of a significant technological change was in submarines, because on submarines, especially post-war, once you get into the nuclear-powered era, how you arrange watches and what people can best cope with is actually quite different compared to aboard a surface vessel where the night-day cycle of the planet is still very much in effect. Sky asks, if guns on ships of whatever size were able to be elevated to a negative angle, would it be possible to use them to shoot torpedoes out of the water? In theory, it's possible, especially with something like the Japanese anti-submarine warfare shells. However, there are some rather significant limitations. If a torpedo is running on the surface or near the surface, i.e. it's malfunctioned, its depth keeping isn't actually up to spec, then something like a 20mm or 40mm anti-aircraft gun could plausibly actually shoot a torpedo out of the water. The shells would have enough energy to get through a small amount of water, penetrate the torpedo and explode. So, technically possible. Bigger guns, 4-inch, 4.5-inch, 5-inch, etc., the shells can obviously go deeper, but it's going to be commensurately a lot harder to get them to elevate downwards enough to make a difference, because remember, you've got to spot the torpedo as well. So even if your gun can go below zero, maybe down to 3 or 4 degrees, given that that gun might be 20, 30 foot above the water, when you fire it downwards, that's still going to only land a fair distance away from the ship. So you need to spot the torpedo in time, and bear in mind, you're probably spotting the torpedo's track, which means you have to lead the torpedo, which is a bit of deflection shooting. And of course, really big guns, even so, a lot of those could go a few degrees below negative, but once again, you've got to fire them far enough away from the ship, or the torpedo has to be far enough away from the ship in order for the shell to actually arrive. So theoretically, yes, but with any of the major ship's guns, it essentially requires you to spot the torpedo far enough out that, for whatever reason, evasion is not really on the cards, and have shells loaded in the guns and get those guns trained quickly enough, which with battleship guns is very unlikely. Maybe with a 5-inch gun you might just about manage it. Then you've got to put them down and effectively manually calculate the firing solution, because there's no fire control computer in World War I or World War II that's ever going to work out the firing solution on a torpedo that's closing in on you. So extremely unlikely, except by the most bizarre of coincidences, albeit, as I said, shallow running torpedoes with 20 or 40 mil cannon firing at them, yes, that might be done. But if the torpedo's going deep enough, then kind of the weapons that you could theoretically use to reach it are probably not going to be not going to be quick enough to track, even if you spot it in time. Joe Fitzgerald asks, what would have been the effect of having gas turbine technology installed in Royal Navy ships during World War II? Well, gas turbines are more compact. They generate more power per ton than steam turbines do. Obviously, they don't need water, so feed water is not so much of a problem. They have a lot of advantages. That's the reason why they are used an awful lot in warships in the Cold War period. However, they do have a couple of major disadvantages. One, they need air like there's no tomorrow, and two, they are less efficient in terms of fuel use compared to a steam turbine. So a ship that's equipped with gas turbines will need to carry more fuel to go a similar distance, assuming weights and everything else are the same, as compared to a steam turbine vessel. On the other hand, gas turbine does allow almost instantaneous power output changes, which a steam turbine doesn't. So if gas turbine technology had been around and widely available for Royal Navy ships during the Second World War, because it was around, just as you can see here, this was a MGB 2009, the first gas turbine equipped warship in the Royal Navy, and that was towards the end of the Second World War. But if it had been in more widespread circulation, then I suspect you would have seen a change to propulsion plant layouts, obviously depending how far back you go when these things could be refitted, because it would take a lot to refit older ships, a lot of effort to refit their engine spaces. Newer ships obviously could be designed with them, but regardless, I suspect the ideal layout the Royal Navy would have then seen fit to do would have been similar to how some World War I warships had a set of cruising turbines, usually on the inner propeller shafts, and then a set of high-speed turbines on the outer propeller shafts. This was before geared turbines became a thing. And then, obviously, as the name suggests, you'd use your low-speed turbines for cruising and low-speed manoeuvres, and then if you really needed to kick into gear, you'd get the outer engines fired up. I suspect that probably would have been a similar approach to what the Royal Navy would have taken, because the other thing is that gas turbines are not only just generally slightly less efficient than the steam turbine, they're also massively less efficient at low speeds. But for a cruiser or battleship, etc., it would actually make a fair bit of sense to have a conventional geared steam turbine running the two central shafts, and then gas turbines running the outer shafts, because you could cruise around on the, relatively speaking, fuel-efficient steam turbines at lower speeds, but when you needed to go into combat, you could effectively flick a switch and have full power ready almost instantaneously, which would actually give Royal Navy ships a massive turn of acceleration and speed and a huge degree of control over how fast they were going and where they were going, etc., which would be quite advantageous for them. The other major advantage would have been, because the gas turbines are lighter, they probably would be saving several hundred tons possibly on machinery weight, which of course means that that's weight that can go to other things like guns or armour or more guns or even more guns, because you can get a lot of 20 and 40mm guns for several hundred tons. Texas and La Choc asks, when are new constructions commanding officers assigned, and what are their responsibilities prior to taking their ship to sea? It varies quite considerably between nations and even within a given nation in given time periods. So, for example, in the Royal Navy, as one example where I can find regulations that exist, you would have an officer, not necessarily the commanding officer, who would become the senior officer overseeing a ship under construction, and their main responsibilities would be to effectively supervise the final stage construction and fitting out of the ship prior to it being commissioned into the Navy, at which point obviously a captain is appointed. At some point between that senior officer coming in to make sure that everything's going to plan and the actual commission of the vessel, a commanding officer, a captain, will be appointed to the ship, and then when he arrives he will take over the duties of the senior officer. But that might be a few weeks before the ship's commissioned. It might, depending on the exigencies of the time, it might be the day before, it might be several months before, and then they will take over the duties of that senior officer, basically again making sure that the ship is fitted out and made operational by the dockyard to the standard that the Navy requires, and then it will be commissioned and accepted into the Navy, at which point the captain will then take the ship to sea. But that varies quite considerably depending on, let's say, time period and nation. So in the old days, in the age of sail, for example, in the United States, a captain might be instructed to go and attend to a ship, and when he arrives he might find a ship that's either about to launch or just has launched but still has a lot of fitting out to do, and then he has a much more direct role in supervising the final fit out of the ship, how it's ballasted, how it's loaded, making sure that the appropriate armament is secured, recruiting a crew, etc. and so forth. So it becomes almost part of the ship's construction crew rather than just someone who's in a more overseeing and supervisory role, making sure that nothing goes horribly wrong. And other nations, other time periods, etc., it can be everything in between those. So when exactly a new construction ship's captain is assigned, it's a how long is a piece of string question, unfortunately. Miko Leitner asks, for what did the Rear Admirals Kidd, Scott and Callaghan get their Congressional Medals of Honor? To me, their actions pretty much seem to be what you'd expect from a senior commander and don't seem to show any particular courage. Especially Callaghan as a weird pick, since under his command the first night of the naval battle of Guadalcanal, he's a significant contributor to the chaos of the battle and perhaps even some of the casualties. Is there something I'm not seeing? Well, they are the only 3 US admirals to have been killed in action during World War II, so I guess there's a connection there. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the US Navy gives Medals of Honor to all its admirals, flag officers who are killed in action. I don't know that for certain, but it certainly seems to be a connecting factor. Looking up their various citations, however, I think partly, it's to acknowledge some genuine heroism on the parts of some of the individuals in question, and also in part if I'm being completely blunt, it's also to do with some information that was available to the awarding office at the time being either hopelessly, hilariously incorrect, or perhaps deliberately made so in order to sort of make the citation seem worthwhile. Now, for Admiral Scott, I think of the three, by far merits the most the Medal of Honor, albeit that some elements of his citation are, we now know, incorrect. For example, he didn't sink 8 Japanese vessels during his time in command at the one of the previous actions of Guadalcanal, and we also know he was not killed by Japanese fire. He was killed by friendly fire. How much of that they knew at the time, and how much of that was based on supposition. I mean, the reports of how many Japanese vessels were sunk at the time in his previous actions, okay, they're not necessarily going to know that till after the war, so that much can be taken on good faith at the time. But given that he had been killed and Atlanta had come under both enemy and friendly fire, how much they knew it had been San Francisco that had actually killed him, and how much it may have just been genuinely they thought that he had died under the fire of Japanese guns, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. For Callaghan, I've got to admit, reading his Medal of Honor citation makes me just kind of go, okay, sure, let's go with that one. Then again, Admiral Wright at the Battle of Tassafaronga managed to get it written into the official reports that he'd sunk an Atago-class cruiser and a bunch of other Japanese ships, when in fact all he'd managed to do was blow up a single destroyer. So the fact that the Medal of Honor citation makes Callaghan sound like a tactical genius rather than someone who actually, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, fair enough, had probably a relatively decent ambush going and then proceeded to ruin it. Well, it is what it is. Admiral Kidd, of course, was the admiral who died aboard USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. And, okay, well, it wasn't exactly a battle, but he did give his life in service to his navy and his country whilst under enemy air attack, or enemy attack generally, so that's fairly meritorious. And I don't know enough details about exactly what he was said to have done or not done in the immediate run-up whilst Arizona was under attack, and I suspect, to be perfectly honest, that anything that could and was said about him was probably pieced together from the relatively few survivors of Arizona. So, in as much as he was a flag officer, he remained in command of his ship, and he died when the ship was destroyed. Okay, yeah, fair enough. I mean, I don't know enough about the exact criteria as to why Medals of Honor are awarded or not awarded to say whether or not that has merit enough for a Medal of Honor, but it certainly is meritorious conduct deserving of some form of recognition. So of the three, I'd say Scott, despite there being some errors of fact in his citation, probably deserves the award. Kidd would be down to someone who's far more expert in how Medals of Honor are awarded to say one way or the other. But again, he did his duty. Callaghan, I mean, you don't speak ill of the dead most of the time, but yeah, I do find the difference in what we now know about that battle versus his citation to be a little bit wide of the mark. But, as I say, then again, how much did they actually know at the time when they were making that citation? How much of it was for propaganda effect, and how much of it may have just been, as I say, simply the fact he was a US admiral who died in action, facing the enemy. If that is sufficient in and of itself, regardless of anything else, then maybe he does deserve it. It's just one of those things that when it comes to the exact details of how a Medal of Honor is particularly awarded, I don't know enough about that process. If it was the Victoria Cross, again, I'm not an expert on how they award Victoria Crosses, but I know a bit more about that process and I could make a slightly better determination. But the Medal of Honor is a US award, awarded to US officers, so I'll probably leave that there. Dave Peachy asks, I've seen pictures of a number of larger, mainly World War II capital ships, with 1 or 2 booms extended outward from their sides at around deck level. These don't appear to be residual booms for torpedo protection netting, although that may be their origin, given that smaller surface craft, sometimes several in line abreast, are often seen attached to these. My question, therefore, is this. Given the difference in height above the water level between the decks of the smaller craft and the main deck of the larger vessel, how would personnel get from small craft up to the larger vessel? Are there ladders strung down from the boom to each craft with a walkway along the boom, or does one have to scramble over the decks of other smaller craft to get to a ladder or access point in the hull of the larger vessel? These are called boat booms, and you can see them deployed on almost every ship in this photo of the Grand Harbour in Malta during the 1930s. These are a way of allowing ships' boats to moor next to a ship that is not obviously moored next to, or docked up to a quay, but it allows you to effectively store the boats in the water, but not right up next to your hull, where they might bash into your hull with the wake of passing ships and cause damage either to themselves or to possibly your ship, but to be honest, more likely to themselves. And it may not just be the wakes of other ships, it may also be weather, wind and waves, etc. So you can safely store them. And in terms of how would you get out from them, if you've got passengers who are of any particular importance or particular number, the boat would usually come up to the side of the ship and sort of disperse most of its passengers more immediately. But for those who have to be with the boat, or if the boat's only got a small number of people, so it's not worth going right up to the ship, then you can deploy a Jacob's ladder, basically a loose rope ladder or similar, from the boom. You climb up that ladder to the boom, and then you walk along the boom. That might seem somewhat suicidal looking at this picture, but what you don't tend to see in most pictures of boat booms, because obviously they are to the scale of the usually a battleship or a cruiser, is that when you look up right close, obviously these things, they're not just sticking out there completely unsupported. They are rigged with lines and chains, etc., to hold them in position. And one of those lines will be another line that's running about 3-4 foot higher than the boom, which is effectively a safety rail. And also these are fairly substantial bits of wood. These days a lot of them are metal as instead, but they're wide enough that you can comfortably walk along them. It's not like a tightrope balancing act, but you've got that extra line there just for stability to make sure you don't get blown off, or if the ship moves or whatever, you don't get thrown off. And that's how you get to and fro. And that's why you can see, for example, here with Warspite forward, all of those booms, they come into the ship at a point where you could then step off and you're on a deck. The ones on the cruiser and on the auxiliary vessel further back, not so much, but I suspect you probably then find there's either a hatchway or another ladder running up the side of the hull. But a very good question, though. It's not a detail that many people pick up. And so that's it for this week. Thank you very much for listening. Only bit of channel admin is to say the 250k subscriber competition, just as a reminder, has been launched. It's available as a community post on the channel, so go and have a look if you like, and see if you want to take part. Other than that, thank you very much for listening, and hope you've enjoyed your week. Hope you have a good week this coming week, and hope to see you again in another video.